revolutionaries as tools of persuasion for Chavez and Bush, a look into the phenomenon of independence. Okay, so just to describe my intro a little bit that I'm going to write in my paper, I decided to show you guys my research question, so I'm just going to read that for you. How did leader Hugo Chávez's rhetorical use of appeals to South American liberator Simón Bolívar's authority compare to American President George Bush's inclusion of references to the founding fathers, and to what extent can Venezuelans' relationship with their revolution contribute to the vast difference in frequency? So I came up with this question a while ago, but I actually hadn't figured out my methodology until about 2 months ago. So I'm going to go through that as well. And in my introduction, I give context to who Hugo Chavez is, who, if you didn't know, he died in 2013, and he was the Venezuelan president for 16 years. I'm pretty sure everyone knows who George Bush is, and I picked George Bush as kind of a backdrop to focus on Hugo Chavez. So my actual presentation is about Venezuela, but in order to prove a high use of appeals to authority, which I'm going to tell you guys how I define that later, I need a backdrop to see, okay, what's a small amount and what's a big amount. So I decided on George Bush because they were leading their countries at the same time, and also they had kind of a weird relationship with Chavez calling Bush, only referring to him as El Diablo because he hated him so much he couldn't say his name. So I thought it would be kind of interesting. Okay, so here are a few terms. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to go through two that are really important to my paper. So the first one is discourse, which is really important in my method, which I'm going to describe later, because it's called critical discourse analysis. So I thought I'd say what CDA, that's the acronym, what CDA academics call discourse. And it's the whole process of social interaction of which text is just a part. So when we talk about analyzing discourse, we're not just talking about words, but also body language, eye contact, that kind of thing. The whole process of how we interact together. So that can even mean media, stuff like that. And also appeal to authority. So my whole project is based off of looking into appeals to authority in the rhetoric of Chavez. So this is what appeal to authority is defined as: a technique by which a rhetor seeks to persuade an audience not by citing evidence, but by appealing to the respect people have for the mentioned authority. So for my paper, I define it just as any mention of Bolivar, because my assumption is that mentioning Simón Bolivar, who, sorry, again to say who that was, South American liberator who freed a lot of Latin America from Spanish colonial rule in the early 1800s. Any mention of him would be to gain credibility, to persuade an audience, and also mention of the founding fathers. I have a list of them below. In America, that would be the comparison. Okay, so now I'm going to describe pretty in-depth my method, because it took me a really long time to figure out what it would be, and I believe that it's a very close match to my research question and what I hope to achieve through my research. So I chose critical discourse analysis, looking at a lot of different fields because I was confused. Is this history? Is this, I knew I wanted to study it, but is it linguistics? Is it sociology? I found out that a certain type of sociolinguistics is called critical discourse analysis. And one definition given is an analysis of language that aims to investigate how much texts arise out of and are ideologically shaped by relations of power and struggles of power. So I thought, wow, that is actually pretty tailored to my research question, because it's talking about how language is used to persuade and arguably manipulate the constituency of Venezuela. So CDA isn't actually a method. It's what the founders of CDA, a man named Dr. Fairclough and Dr. Van Dyke, call a shared perspective. So there are a lot of different ways that you can go about conducting CDA, which was perfect for my research because I wanted to have a specific method. So basically it's justifiable if it meets the above definition, which I believe that it does. So it differs from formal discourse analysis with the inclusion of the word critical, which means that you're not just analyzing the discourse, which I talked about earlier, is not just text but everything around it. You're also talking about why it's imperfect and why it may need to change and why it arises out of differences in power. So I'm going to conduct I have conducted most of my CDA for the speeches of Chavez, and I'm not actually going to conduct CDA for Bush. I'm just using some of his speeches as a backdrop to show that appeals to authority are more rampant in the speeches of Chavez than in other world leaders. And I just wanted to say a disclaimer here that doesn't mean that I'm saying that in Venezuela Chavez's speeches were used to manipulate the constituency any more than in any other country. Like, for instance, Bush used a lot of references to 9/11 that a lot of people would think were just, not necessary. And some people say that his references to human rights and 9/11 were used to persuade people in a manipulative way. But I'm just using that as kind of like a platform. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about my method for a little bit longer. So, Norman Fairclough, who's the father of CBA, he was a sociolinguist in the 90s. He talked about a three-dimensional framework for critical discourse analysis. And so, you can see the description here, but the first stage is a description, the second an interpretation, and the third an explanation. So basically you can say that your research is critical discourse analysis if it meets these three categories, but you can kind of go about each of them in any way that you think matches the definitions. And I have some books that talk about this three-dimensional framework, and so that I can make sure that my research is actually tailored to this. So another way to say it is the text itself is the first one, the process of production and interpretation is the second, and the social conditions of production and interpretation. So what I'm talking about in my research question when I say, how is these rates of appeals to Simón Bolivar's authority related to Venezuelans' revolutionary culture and their relationship with their War of Independence? That's what I'm talking about social conditions, and in my case, it's history. Okay, so this is just one example of some of the work that I've done so far on stage 1. So I can explain to you what this is, but I've broken down Bush and Chavez's speeches into a couple of categories. So I'm talking about economic policy, foreign policy, inaugural speeches. So for Chavez, that's 3, and for Bush, that's 2. Some electoral speeches, and reform. So for instance, for Bush, there were a couple speeches about he wanted to make an amendment to the Constitution, that didn't work out, stuff like that. New things. And for the movement that Chavez was starting, reform was a huge part of it because it was bringing socialism into Venezuela, so there are a lot of interesting speeches about that. So stage 1, description. I'm just looking at the text and just seeing the observable facts about what's really there. So, okay, so here is just an example of what I've done so far. I take the title of the speech, I put how many words are in the speech, and then I say how many ATA, that's appeals to authority, are in it. And ATA, as I said, I'm defining that as how many mentions of either founding father or Simón Bolivar. And that's how many words are dedicated to talking about them with their name in it. So if it was the founding fathers, it would be 3. If it was Simón Bolivar, it would be 2. If it was Bolivarian Revolution, it would be 1. That's just how I decided to do it. And I picked these, most of these speeches, I tried to do it like randomly. So for Bush, the compilation of speeches was easy to find because the American government has a system of just recording all of them. For Chavez, it was a lot harder. So for Bush, it was easy to do it randomly because I could just look at the whole, all the speeches he ever did about economic policy and just like put them in like one of those little sorter things and just it spits one out for you in Excel. For Chavez, it was a little harder, so that's one of the things I'm working on about my limitations, but it was basically what I could find. So as you can see, there aren't very many appeals to authority in Bush, and in Chavez there are a lot, and I have like a bunch of these spreadsheets that will go into my paper. Okay, so stage 2, the process of production and interpretation. So this stage in my paper is going to be like a couple paragraphs for stage 2 and stage 3 that's citing like different aspects of the speeches just for Chavez. So here are a couple questions that I asked for each one. Was there a teleprompter or was it an impromptu speech? Because that's a process of production, like how was it produced? For instance, speech like the inaugural address that he gives is very different from the last speech before he died. Like for instance, the last speech before he died, he never gave speeches on Saturdays, he never talked to the public on Saturdays, and it was a Saturday night, and so then he starts talking about Saturday Night Fever for about like 10 minutes, and like he was about to die. Like it's absolutely crazy. So obviously it's a different process of production. He's like, oh my gosh, John Travolta, he's so good, and then he immediately starts talking about how they need to revolt and like take over, so it's yeah, it's very interesting. So was it televised or live? Like also because Chavez he was thought of by a lot of Venezuelans as being connected to the people, so sometimes he would have like surprise speeches where he would just come into like one of the cities and just talk for hours on end. So that's what I mean by live. Like, was it like planned out or live? And then the occasion of the speech, like, like the policy, for example, for Bush that I just showed you guys, like, was there a topic or that kind of thing, and the political climate at the time. Because Chavez, his Bolivarian revolution, definitely went through like highs and lows of public approval. So depending on like the public approval, possibly maybe his rate of appeals to authority that he's using, talking about Simón Bolivar, could be different. So I'm gonna look at that as well. So stage 3, social conditions. And this is what I think is like really the heart of my project. So I can just read through this really quickly. A couple things I'm going to talk about is discursive events that are affecting the text. So that's basically historical patterns. It's like pretty much the same thing, but these are what's important too. Looking at stage 3 and seeing how society affects discourse and discourse affects society. So also I have a bunch of polls from the general viewpoints of Venezuela. How could that affect what he said as well? And then analysis of the War of Independence. Like, why does he talk about Simón Bolivar so much? Is there something different about this War of Independence than others that makes it relevant today, even though it happened like almost 200 years ago? Okay, last slide. So the significance. So the significance in the general broad speaking of it is that society affects discourse and vice versa. And therefore, so does history. So history affects discourse. And I think that this is just important to think about as we go through our lives using language all the time. And this is just a very focused look at one example of why CDA is important and why maybe like it's important to look at rhetoric in the political sphere as something that is very tailored to you specifically, and maybe not take it with a grain of salt, but just keep that in mind. So a big tenet of CDA is that it needs to be focused on change, and so it needs to have, in the end of a formal critical discourse analysis, a suggestion for the future. So I think that's perfect for my significance and for my significance, because there are a lot of things that are going on in Venezuela right now that are pretty terrible. So an opposition for the first time just got into the legislature. So a majority of the more Democratic Party, it's called the Democratic Unity Party, is in the legislature than the Socialist Party, but a socialist leader is still in the presidency. So a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the government is still very similar to Chavez. So I think that even though he did pass away, this is still an important topic to look at. And again, like I said about the Bush thing, these appeals to authority in Chavez's speeches are just one example of what happens like in almost all politics in the rhetoric. So it's also important to just look at this like with a world view, that this is something that happens everywhere, even definitely in Singapore, definitely in the United States. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.